Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have the honor of having on the legendary Jacques Vallée. Welcome, Jacques.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you on again, and I'm very excited to talk to you. You just have recently released Forbidden Science Volume 6, Scattered Castles, and that's your newest edition. And back there on the bookshelf, I have some of the previous editions. Always extraordinary to hear the behind the scenes look from Jacques Vallée's perspective on the phenomenon and all the ongoing research and inquiries into the phenomenon. So to just set this off, uh, I want people to kind of get a feel of where you're coming from. And so the Forbidden Science series altogether, you know, number one, you know, what drove you to release it? Yeah, let's start there. So what drove you to start releasing these journals?
I have a number of friends whose names you would recognize who are writing, personal or keeping personal records, and they are not publishing them, or they will allow their wives or husbands to publish them after their death with heavy editing. Uh, I I felt that I needed to, apart from the more wide books that I've written and published that are out there and have had, as you know, many editions, I felt the need to record things for myself because, especially in science, during your life, you change, you're exposed to different things. You tend to gravitate to the things that get to the surface, the things that. But when a scientist in a scientific career, you're going to try 10 experiments that are really big experiments, and 8 of them will fail. And people will remember you for the two that worked. And, look at Einstein. I mean, a lot of the things that Einstein said about quantum mechanics, for example, were wrong. I mean, he was plainly wrong, and I'm not even sure he recognized it in the end. So, in the life of any scientist, that's always true because new things happen and your colleagues move ahead and there are things that you have to integrate in what you do. So I don't have a very good memory and I wanted to keep a record so that I could sort of calibrate myself um, and learn from errors. There are mistakes and there are errors in science. Um, and both are important to recognize if you want to make progress and learn new things. And I wanted to do that. And the journal is a good way of doing that. It's a literary genre that I think is not very much appreciated these days. And one publisher who had published another book of mine said, we can't publish your diary because, you tell a story in the first 20 pages, and I think is going to go somewhere. And then on page 21, you start talking about something else. And I never know, it doesn't resolve itself. Well, life doesn't resolve itself except with death. So I thought that, of course, that's the nature of a diary, and life is painful this way, uh, but at the same time, I mean, whatever happened to abductions? 20 years ago, there were 25 books on the shelves about abduction and what to do and how to hypnotize people and so on. And now the subject is still there, but it's in the background. We've moved on with other things that are more interesting to the public or to science. If you take my diaries, there is uh, recorded series of topics that renew themselves and that follow, over more than 50 years. And I think um, that's what I want to leave, even though I know there is not as big a public for a diary as there is for, a manifesto or, a book that takes just one subject from beginning to end. And I've written some of those other books, but to me, the labor of love is forbidden science, because I've been a witness to things that most people have not seen from inside science and from an international perspective that may be useful for other people.
Y- Yeah, I want to personally thank you for putting these journals out. I do think there's a great historical importance, you know, in part given that Jacques Vallée is often referred to as the godfather of ufology. So I mean it just really, again, like you said, your perspective on this, I think, is important in regards that you were there from what we consider almost like the beginning of modern ufology. You were working with Hynek. You had a SRI, right? The Air Force was there. You were kind of in the mix of everything all throughout all these years. But I just the quick tangent side questions, just because you did bring up abductions, and I wanted to get into this at some point. Uh, Dr. Eric Davis has all but said, the Wilson Davis memo. He is the author of it. He more or less has said that on the record, just with the caveat that, like, before he says that as an actual statement, he should probably talk to a lawyer, kind of thing, right? But what do you make of in that conversation? The alleged conversation that Dr. Eric Davis had with Vice Admiral Tom Wilson in regards to the comment being brought up about, oh, there's no abductions.
I think abductions, that's a subject that you need to get very close to in order to understand the full impact of it. And I've had the privilege of, as you know, of working with the team at Bass and with Bob Bigelow, and we've had many psychologists and many people interested in abductions, uh, in addition to uh, people who had written about the subject and researched it. I think Bass even or Niz bought some of the collections of original records, and some people donated original records of interviews and so on to me, and all of that is now uh, I've turned it over to
Right.
Dr. Kreipel
Yeah.
and at his university. And so those will be preserved. And it's important to take the whole thing. Some of it, a, a psychologist who has not researched it would say, well, I have people in my office telling me stories like that all the time. And most of the time it's a nightmare, or it's a dream, or they took some drug and then they experience that. It's only when you've studied maybe 100 of them or more that you begin to see what emerges, what are the constant things. And the skeptics have a point that the part of the information is missing. But part of the information is missing because the reality of the witness is taken over by something, by an external phenomenon. And I used to have that conversation with Aimé Michel in France, who said, you know, we can't do science with this because the moment you're ready for the observation, the thing that you're observing takes over the, you know, the experiment. And then,
Yeah, sure.
and he had, especially there is a well-known case in France called the Dr. X case. I met the witness and his family, stayed in touch with the family after he died, and so on. A very, very, very strange case of a man who was trained in at least one, you know, one field of medicine actually, and science, who was a very gifted pianist, who was an intelligent man, and we could never find out exactly what had happened, even though we had, you know, he wanted to know what had happened. We went to the place several times. Aimé Michel had researched it. Pierre Guérin had researched it in France. We still don't know exactly what happened. The fact is that he had a mark on his stomach, a triangle, you know, a red triangle, and which was, you know, a pigmentation. And doctors examined it, and it was actual pigmentation. It wasn't red paint. And then the same thing happened on the body of his son, of first the baby, and by the time the kid was 12 or so on, it would reappear sometimes of year. Well, that's something, there is a lot to study there for a scientist, and still we could never get to actually prove anything specific. And that's part of the frustration. There are abductions, as you know, that have been well studied with competent hypnosis, and that also had physical manifestations attached to them. And those are the keepers. Those are the ones on which you can start building something. There are also cases where, you know, instrumentation has been put in the environment of a person who was maybe not exactly abducted, but was visited at night by entities. And to some extent, those have been successful. I mean, we did those experiments at NIDS, and we did them also outside of NIDS, and you know, with Dr. Puthoff and others and medical people, and you know, those were real. The question is, should they be published? Do you want to expose the life of a, you know, a professional to the fact that there were these incidents, you know, in his or her house. But I think that you would find that all of us on the team were convinced that the phenomena were real. Now, the, should we jump to the conclusion that so many people jump to, that those are ETs trying to study the human race and so on? I don't think so. I don't think we're ready to do that. And to some extent, many people give up. Many researchers, good researchers, gave up because you got to a point where you just couldn't learn anything more that you could, when you could design an experiment that would prove something. So we're left with the impression that the public has that, you know, ETs are coming here, abducting us to see how we think and what we react to, and maybe our physiology and so on, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, on the face of the, rational logic of the story, it doesn't make any sense. For one thing, I've shown statistically that you would, if you got all the reports that are potentially there, if you take that assumption, we should have hundreds of thousands of reports of abductions. Now, how many people do you need to abduct before you find out, what's going on the earth? I mean, many things you could, all that information you could get from a little satellite in orbit somewhere that nobody would ever detect. So that argument doesn't fail. So that's a question. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of people who have been, in some cases, hurt or have had profound experiences like Whitney. And then on the other side, we lack the tools to really go into that mass of data in what people would recognize as a scientific way
You
or a
said,
medical way.
yeah, that with the NIDS, and there was documentation of some of these experiments. What that you said that has not been published.
I had that problem in this book, in Forbidden Science 6, because I talk about a series of, I've cut it down a lot. But the ones that I mentioned were real cases where something was interfering with a very high level executive, a financial executive, and I've preferred not to. I could have given his name. He was okay with that. I decided not to because now, as you know, the subject is very chaotic with lots of people arguing in ways that are very unfair and mistreating the witnesses. And I don't want to expose the people who trust me with their observations. I don't want to expose them to that kind of bullshit, if you forgive the expression.
Yeah, what kind of things were recorded or observed?
There were a number of infrared cameras in his bedroom, and there were things happening. Not only, essentially, those were visitations by lights or by small things that were moving around, that were not moving around like a dust particle would move around, uh, with the air conditioning or something like that. And they were clearly interested in him. Um, and then there were a few cases where there was actually an entity there at the edge of the room that could be detected. And then other phenomena that people in the 19th century would have called poltergeist, uh, things that moved around. He lived alone and was very meticulous about everything in his house. And he noticed it when things were changing, and we got pictures of that.
And in regards to the lights and being interested in him, and I guess you can say orbs, so somewhat. You discussed that your wife had experiences similar to that.
Yes, um, we bought a property in the redwood forest, 2 hours north of San Francisco. Um, and there was no there were a house there we could use, and I built a small tower as an observatory in the middle of the redwood forest, where the closest neighbors were 3/4 mile away. And at night, the sky was perfect. So I installed a telescope there, and I did, my own astronomy uh, amateur experiments. But those were things that you can love to do as an amateur. even if you have done them as a professional before. And that was very enjoyable. And I thought, this is a discontinuity, in the middle of a forest that's completely dark at night. And this could be a point that would intrigue. If there are things moving around in the sky, they might want to investigate this, and it might attract attention either from an information point of view or from just a geographic point of view. That never happened, or at least if it happened, we weren't there to see it. We sold it after we owned it for 19 years, and my kids grew up there, and it was a wonderful place where friends come over. And then we sold it when my kids grew up and so on. We didn't need it anymore. Shortly before we left, my wife was awakened a couple of times. I wasn't, unfortunately, by actually two small lights that moved around the room. Now, in the room, there were lots of books. I collect rare books, about medieval research and so on. And those lights were moving along the books, and then they vanished. Obviously, they would have had to go through the wall if they came from outside. There was no other way to get in. Many people have described that kind of thing. My wife, Janine, was a psychologist and well trained in impressions and what the mind does with things in your life and so on. And she assured me that this was physical, that she was awake. She was not in a half asleep stage. And then on the last day, when we had filled out all the papers, emptied the whole place, our neighbors, were friends with our neighbors, and they wanted to expand their property. They bought our ranch, and this was fine. And the last day, my wife was alone there, just getting the last few things and moving back to San Francisco. She was awakened in the middle of the night by an extremely bright white UV light going down the path in front of the house. It was a dirt road going back to a small paved road in the forest, and this was very, very bright. There was no physical object that she could see inside. There was a concentration of light, and it followed the road down this path, illuminating everything, illuminating the house. We had a small shack on the other side of the garage, illuminating that and the forest and everything else, and then it vanished. So why? I didn't publish that at the time. I just had to continue to think about it and let it, organize any thoughts that could be related to that. The only thing I can come up with is that something was recognizing that we were leaving. And that's not, well, you can call it a UFO. It was at ground level, though. And the other lights in the tower were also, they didn't come from the sky as far as we could tell. So some people would say, well, that's straight out of parapsychology books. It has nothing to do with flying saucers. You didn't see a craft. You didn't see traces. You didn't see any of that, which is true. So, but here you hit the question of what is the overlap between the range of phenomena in parapsychology and the range of phenomena widely associated with what UFO witnesses report. But it took me a long time, and this is the first time I've actually published it. It took me a long time, in spite of, Whitley Strieber's books and so on, have sort of paved the way for this. But I couldn't. I thought the readers would want more of a structure around it, and here all I can do is give the sort of the naked experience the way it was. And again, I did not see those. As you know, I had when I was about 15, 14 or 15, I had seen a craft and that was seen with two other people in France, back in France. But since then, I really have not seen anything of that type. So I have to rely on that kind of experience, that kind of sighting.
Well, you did recall recently that you had an experience of sorts that you claim that you still have not fully recovered from.
Another one, yes. This was
Well, and
uh,
Jacques, let me preface this a little bit. When I heard you describe it as well, you had mentioned that there were parapsychological, or what in today's kind of vernacular with the recent news we can call psionic, maybe, um, intentional conditions that were set up, maybe a protocol that the result of it was this experience. So is that correct that there was a protocol of sorts?
Yes, there was. And as you may know, I was, turn this off. When I was at the Stanford Research Institute, I was very close to, I was there in one of the computer, ARPANET, internet development um, projects, but I was very close to Dr. Puthoff, Dr. Targ, and some of the experiments they did. So I had a background of dealing uh, in professional scientific structures with apparitions. And not only with remote viewing and all of that that I also participated in, uh, but actual stories that some of the subjects that we dealt with had experience. Of course, the literature talks about that as well, but this was in, hard science conditions. Um, I had been, I had kept my sort of pure, as pure as it could be, scientific position with respect to that. Um, Mostly, out of respect for the experiencers that they knew I was doing rational research on this. Uh, there is a point where a scientist crosses the border from being completely objective to actually experiencing the phenomenon himself or herself. And I think right now a lot of us are crossing that dangerous border. As you may know, Dr. Nolan has made no mystery of what he has experienced, since childhood and so on. Uh, the But I had never done structured experiments.
So can,
Uh, I decided, at my age, I mean, I only have a limited time to try new things, and I actually became involved with people who were doing that kind of experiment, and reported that they were able to manifest the phenomenon on demand.
They're currently doing that?
Yes.
And is that
That,
people
that,
that are out in the public
that's
or
not the only group. I mean, a lot of people try to do that, as you know, including in the Southwest with some of the reports from some of the military people who've claim now that they can, consciously contact objects that are coming close to the ground, and they hope to continue to they hope to grab them and study them.
so
So
I was going to say for this experience that you're about to explain, what were the conditions or the protocols that you used, even in a
I,
summary?
I I don't think I should go into that because I don't want to incite people to do things just for fun. And as we know from Ouija boards and so on, those things can be very, very destructive
I
and
mean,
very,
yeah, well, Jack,
very
I'm gonna
negative.
I want to push back on that a little and say there, there's a number of methods that are out there that people know about CE5. Even the psionic team is going out on the record now and saying how they have done it.
Yes.
So I'm just interested in the approach that you took, you know.
Well, this was very structured. The people who have been experimenting with this in that group, uh, people who've they've read all the books and they've studied all the mistakes and so on. So this was very structured and very and fairly simple. It had to do with designating a particular area and opening your mind to something happening in that in that particular area
Mm,
when you were in a certain state of mind.
yeah.
What I wasn't prepared for that is that in this particular case, it was an out of body experience. I expected, and this was structured to be a conscious experience in when I was awake. I wasn't awake. I was sleeping, and I continued to sleep. I was taken out of my body, which uh, I've never done, and instantly moved to the area where I was in the presence of this entity. And then uh, my reaction was fear, terror, terror of being outside my body, not so much terror of the entity. The entity itself wasn't terribly scary. It was I only perceived it for certainly less than a minute, and then I was. I think my reaction was such that I was precipitated back into my body, and I woke up shaking, crying, just completely, uh, reacting to it in fear, but more in fear that, when people try to, and I've worked with a number of people who have gone out of their body, including some names in American electronic science that you would recognize, so, including a really great inventor of the technology we're using now, who went out of his body a number of ways, and in fact, uh, but always under in relatively continuous conditions, not abrupt conditions, the way it happened to me. So I was familiar with their experiences. The and there I have no doubt about the reality of what happens. We don't exactly learn the conditions, but the As you may know, there are a number of books and people who actually teach how to do that. It's dangerous because some people have described great difficulty in getting back into their body once they were floating around, including some of our friends within the Bigelow team. So uh, those really need to be very structured and controlled. It's best to do it with someone else guiding you or being aware of what happens to you. And for one thing, making sure that during the experience, your body is safe. Um, this was very abrupt. I'm not sure I want to do it again. Uh, but the nature of the entity is something that I continue to study and try to recall because it's relevant to what other people have said. So I want to use that as my guide into understanding what witnesses tell me.
And
So
what
at some point, I mean, if you're a doctor, there are some experiments you have to do on your own body, before you can really understand what your patients are going through. And this is sort of the way I see that particular experiment.
and just for people watching and listening, what can you describe the entity?
It was, as you know, I'm pretty tall. I'm over 6 foot tall. It was as tall as I was. It was darker. This was obviously at night. Uh, it had its back to a window, uh, a window that was looking at San Francisco at night. But essentially, the outside was dark with some city lights, and so I didn't get any uh, structural details, other than this was conscious and it had a sense of occupying the space for a reason. I mean, this was not just like a piece of furniture. But it was a block.
Yeah, but personally, when I was younger, I had experiences with something that almost looked like a shadow entity that had like a scintillation to it. And in that experience, I didn't do any kind of protocol. I was just a kid, and this happened more than a half dozen times. And those experiences were frightening because I was awake in these instances, and there was what you can call a telepathic lock on. And it wasn't just like I heard a voice. I could feel it in my whole body and my consciousness field. Um, but you know, on the out of body condition, I had an experience that was something like a trauma induced out of body experience that simulated a near death experience due to a car accident that I was in. And in that out of body type experience, I came face to face with like a light entity. And I had a knowing, I can say, that this entity was not separate from me somehow. Uh, so just as you say, contemplating the nature of this intelligence, like what is that? Um, I that's just another fascinating angle. I want to use this part of the conversation, Jacques, to discuss something that a colleague in mine, my friend Hermes, or he has a handle, the Hermetic Penetrator, people know him as, that we're working on called Interactivity, and that has to do with the interactive quality and nature of the phenomenon. In that, I guess you could say similar to the meta or the meta control system, there's this feedback loop with this kind of system, right? It's actually something maybe uh, bigger than the idea of, well, there's this craft here, and there's entities inside, and that's the end of it. So just with that in consideration, what do you make of the idea that you can somehow participate and to either interfere or get the control system or the meta system to react, and then even what is that?
That's very important because that's the thing that is not taken into account by all the projects, including, as you know, I was part of the BAS project, which was, the military intelligence sponsored project that unfortunately terminated after 2 years when we had designed the protocols for the full 5 years of the development. Um, Nonetheless, we learned a number of things in a structured environment that were also things that we heard from civilian witnesses and so on. And as you know, I've gone to a number of countries to listen to people, uh, including Argentina and Brazil and places like that where a lot has happened. The the, most of the witnesses in extended experiences say the same thing you do. That there is more than just what they've seen. I had a chance to meet with the minister who was in Papua uh, when the natives called him uh, out of his church to show him something in the sky when there was an object in the sky, apparently with people on top of it motioning to the natives, and the natives were responding, and everybody was excited about that. It's one of the classic cases. Dr. Hynek went there, and so on, and it's well written, well described. Well, I had a chance to meet with this minister in London one time, having tea, and in that very relaxed atmosphere, I brought up what he had seen, and he described it the way I had read it in the books. But so I asked, did anything strange happen before? I mean, what happened in the morning? He said, well, not much. I mean, this was, the natives came to the door and they showed me this thing. And I said, well, are you sure that, nothing, what was your state of mind? And he said, well, come to think of it, earlier in the morning, there was a knock on the door. And I went to the door and there was nobody there. Well, this isn't like you were in Paris or London. I mean, he was essentially close to the beach with his little church and really nothing around the church. So what was it that knocked on the door? And that most investigators don't ask that kind of question because they want to know what happened, what did you do, what did they do, and so on. And they proceed on a logical, sequential thing. Well, this phenomenon is not sequential. It does all kinds of things that set up the sighting, set up the interaction, and it's unless you make an effort to reconstruct everything that happened, you get lost. It is a control system, and you're inside, and so that's a problem it's a basic problem for science because, if I have this pen and I drop the pen, you can predict what's going to happen. I mean, the pen is going to fall on the table. That happens every time. Well, not so with this field. With this field, it doesn't happen every time because we're inside a system that's controlling the entire interaction. I went to one of the times I went to Russia was to study. It was as a result of a case called Voronezh. Uh, in This was in, I think, in 2000, and the New York Times itself had uh, articles about the fact that kids had seen something in Voronezh, and there were strange entities going around the town, which was, was not very surprising. But what was surprising was that it was the Russian press had made a big thing out of it, and it was described in Pravda. So New York Times had a good time with that, and everybody laughed that, the Russians are making up UFO stories, and people had seen UFOs in addition to these beings. Well, uh, I had a friend in France who had done a lot of research on UFOs for Le Figaro, which is one of the major newspapers in France. And at first, the Russians had said, no, you can't, we don't have time to invite you and to, have you in Moscow. But then we got together, and when we applied to go there together, they agreed. We were very well treated. We were very well received. It was a time when, Gorbachev was coming to power. The Soviet Union was falling apart. They were going back to just Russia, uh, and it was an extraordinary time there. So we said we met with a number of people, including UFO researchers that I already knew from before. I had been in Russia twice before, and but then we said we'd like to talk to the people from Voronezh, and Voronezh is, I mean, most Americans have no idea where it is. It's an hour flight south of Moscow. It's a large city. It's a city the size of Philadelphia, and it's also a major nuclear center. So it's not a little place just, covered with snow somewhere in Siberia. And there is a university there and so on. So we couldn't take the time to go there, but they flew the team of the researchers from Voronezh. I'm getting back to your idea of the control system because they what they described is something that was an extraordinary case seen by lots of people. It was on a public place where something landed. There were beings outside, close to the public. It was seen by scientists, it was seen by kids, it was seen by passersby. There were lots of testimony. This was not at all the way it was described in the New York Times. The New York Times just laughed at it and brushed it off as propaganda of some sort. And this was not propaganda. It was not used in any political sense or anything. It may have a symbol of what was going on, in the former Soviet Union, and the empire falling apart and Russia recovering its own identity and all those things that we tend to brush off about Russia, including now, of not really understanding what the depth of what's going on around us in the world. The team that came with drawings, they came with photographs, it came with their investigations, their recordings, and we spent the afternoon with them in Moscow. Um, Novosti gave us an office next to the office of the director, so we were in great conditions to to do research, and we had a whole team with us because there were Russian researchers based in Russia, in Moscow, with us talking to the Voronezh research team. Well, the control was obvious that this was a fairly massive. Um, it wasn't just a sighting; it was a series of things that imprinted themselves on the consciousness of all the people who were there. It was something that sort of took over the environment of this. You know, in a city with a university, with a nuclear power plant, with all kinds of modern things, and this was I've never forgotten it because it was very much in your face, on a large scale. Um, we were able to clear up a lot of things that people are still talking about as uh, details that have to do with perceptions and so on. All that we studied and we published except that nobody's read it. So people who've read it have put it in the context of, the things that happen in Russia, which is fine. But the significance, there are cases like that where you can penetrate the control. You can see how the how the occurrence is structured, but to do that, you have to go there, you have to talk to the people who were there, and you have to study it from different streams. It's complicated, it's difficult. Very few people have done that. And by the way, the government project that's going on now has never done anything like that. I mean, they are just superficially reviewing the cases from a year ago, and that's not the way you do science. I mean, so yes, there is a control system, and the question is, can we design an experiment that forces the control system to reveal itself? Because the control system has a reference point. That's where I use the image of the thermostat. If you put me in a room where the temperature is controlled and I see outside it's snowing and then the sun is here and then it seems that it's warm outside and the temperature in this room is not changing, I have to think that there is a mechanism that's controlling my environment, and I have to start looking for it. And if I find a thermostat and I can guess that it may be the right thing, I can change the thermostat and I can change the temperature around me. Okay? So we have not done that yet. There are a number of people who've written, interesting theories about that on how do you force a control system to reveal itself. I thought I had done a good job, building an observatory in the middle of hundreds of acres of pure redwood forest, and that didn't work. As you know, there's a biologist who had the Nobel Prize, uh, for a technique of analysis of biology, who had the same experience. His place in the forest was 50 miles from me, and he's described it as one day going outside in the middle of the night and meeting a little entity who said, "Good night, doctor." And after that, he doesn't remember anything except waking up the next morning. And so, and he published that. And again, this is someone with a Nobel Prize. Uh, and how do you, again, he was precipitated inside a control system. I mean, what was that entity doing on the path at night, close to his home? And, it obviously took control of him.
Yeah. So there's been a number of quotes that you've made over the years in regards to getting the control system to react. And one of them was for messengers of deception. It says we have to do something that will cause them to react. And I don't mean building landing strips in the desert and waiting out their welcome uh, to the Space Brothers. So, what are you
Well, it
refer?
worked for Spielberg.
Yeah. So, what are you referring to in getting them to react? The phenomenon.
Well, first we have to give up a lot of the equipment that we carry as scientists because it's not appropriate. It's just um, uh, let me give you just one more case. We I was involved in a series of experiments in a place that's a little bit like the ranch in New Mexico, except it's not in New Mexico. It's close to the it's in the eastern part of the U.S., southeast part of the U.S. And there were a number of things that have happened over the years on that in those a series of properties there that have been under watch by ufologists. And um, I went there with a man who had invented a lot of very high technology for Hollywood, and he had special cameras that he was experimenting with. There were expectations that something would happen over a large field, a prairie, actually, where there was cattle, uh, that at night. And there was a little cabin there that had little windows, narrow windows, to keep track of the cattle. And there was a table inside. Again, it was something like 10 feet by 10 feet. So we put one of these cameras there overnight, looking outside, locked. We locked the cabin, locked everything, nobody could get in. In the morning, we wanted to see what might be on the film. The camera had been turned 90 degrees away, 180 degrees away from the window. Now the camera was
Right.
locked. It was still locked, to the part, and no trace of anybody entering. The door was still locked. Nothing else had been changed. So it's a phenomenon that has the capability of interacting with us on this level with material things. And uh, Mr. Bigelow has studied that for a long time on a personal basis, creating situations where things might come and change the conditions as a way of trying to interact. And he has been fairly open about what he had done. Um, and to some extent, we participated in some of those experiments. Others continue. And yes, the phenomenon will come and change the conditions. The question is, how do you go from there to developing a language or structure where you can do more? And I think there are people engaged in doing exactly that. And I would completely applaud going into that kind of experiment. Has to be very structured where you can measure everything. You can document everything that you know how to document. And then there are all the other things that you don't know. And that's the way you do science. I mean, that's the way a biologist would study ants or bees or whatever. You give them, you put things in their path, and you see how they deal with it. If you, I had those conversations with biologists in France, including a professor at the Sorbonne, on how do you do that? And he said, well, he did one thing once. He was studying ants, especially and intelligent insects. Well, the insect is not intelligent, but the the group of insects or the hive, if it's bees, is displaying a form of very sophisticated intelligence that you can interact with. So he would he would look at processionary ants that have a path through the forest or through the countryside, and he would dig a trench so that they couldn't continue to do what they were programmed to do. And well, the ants will look at the trench for a while, and they'll try to go down in it, and that doesn't work. So I mean, it doesn't work well. So they go get a long piece of a little piece of wood, little branch that they can carry. So you'll find 20 or 30 ants carrying this little twig, and they will put it across the trench that you've dug, and then they'll continue to go back and forth on the twig. Okay. Now, it takes them, I don't know, maybe half an hour to figure that out, and then they've solved the problem. So he said, he was saying we're faced with the same problem. We have something that's at least as intelligent as we are in ways, and it's different from our intelligence in ways that we don't understand. And we have to design a series of tests so that we can begin to, number one, to show them that we're not fooled by what they were doing. I mean, we're tired of being humiliated by those things. And, I don't want them to abduct my kids. And so I want to react to it in some way. But I'd like to design something that they will react to, that they will find interesting to react to, which is why I built this observatory. They never reacted to the observatory, but they reacted to something else. And that I'm still trying to process that. And if you talk to Mr. Bigelow or to others who've participated in that, um, I believe they would give you the same kind of report, the same kind of testimony.
And you're referring to they reacted to the protocols that you used?
They, in the case of our ranch in Northern California, they um, they reacted to the fact that we had been there and that we had tried to do something beautiful for them to react to. I mean, there was no question that it was a singularity that I had built there. I mean, that tower stood out in the middle of a large redwood forest, and they and they reacted to it, but they reacted to it in their way, and I don't understand how they were doing it.
Well, and here, this is a question in regards to the control system or the meta system, but in somewhat of a nuanced regard, in that if we have this control system or the meta system, let's say, that has this kind of vast capability as far as we can understand it, let's say we're talking about a UFO. Maybe it's a structured craft, maybe it's a craft that's made of light or plasma or something. Maybe there's some kind of psychic phenomenon that's experienced or observed. And on top of that, there's entities of some kind of intelligence beings. Are those, do you think, in your opinion, the let's say the UFO or the craft and the entities are just some kind of vast demonstration or show? Or do you think that there's agency to those entities and the craft, and that the control or the meta system is involved somehow, but is on a higher level than just the entities? Or is it all just one kind of thing, right? Or are there levels of differentiation?
Um, as you know, uh, uh, a good part of my life, I wrote software at different places, and uh, that was, really my degree is in AI, but it's really in computer science. I think of AI as part of computer science. And most people using computers, including very skilled people using computers, use a compiler to build a program that will do something, whether that's for the university or a bank or the army or whatever. Uh, those those programs are written in a language, but somebody at some point has built a meta system that could create languages that people could use to do real things. So the meta system is sort of um, well, with languages, you have English and French and Spanish. You could fuse that into a single structure that out of which you could generate both, English and French and maybe Spanish too. I mean, if you learn Latin, out of Latin you can generate history has generated for modern French and modern Spanish and modern Portuguese and modern Italian to begin with, out of a single syntax, that was used for centuries before. So the I think if we stay at the level of the language we have in science today, we're not going to get there. We have to get to the meta system of science, which is also something that people developing AI now in Silicon Valley, are trying to do, of course. Because if you can get to the meta system, then you can generate any kind of language. You can generate Fortran, COBOL, X, C++ or whatever. And the and then your job is a lot easier because you have a way of looking at the thing globally and analyze it globally. Um, that um, I think we have to think along those lines of how we can get to a more generalized system of science if we're going to meet with this phenomenon on its in its own terms. We're not going to do it by, having what Congress is talking about now. I mean, one more Project Blue Book and so on. I mean, Project Blue Book has been misunderstood. I think it was much more interesting and much more profound than people think. Because, yes, 80% of it can be dismissed, but there were very, very, very interesting things that resulted from Project Blue Book that people have never looked at or people have misunderstood. But we don't need to redo it. What we need to do is go up a level in abstraction. And to some extent, that's what Dr. Nolan is doing, at Stanford, and what I'm trying to participate in, looking at the materials that we've collected. Those materials can give us elements of vocabulary, maybe in a material language. So that's something that we should continue to do. And then we need to look at other instances in science or in the history of thinking, philosophy, that look like meta systems we can apply to our problem. And we're not doing that very well. Now, that's the direction we could go. I mean, we need to enlist the intellectual community to a level where it has not been enlisted so far.
So, in kind of reframing that question a little bit as well as do you think that some of these, let's say the UFOs, right? Say there we have the avocado UFO recovery in 1945, the Trinity case,
Yes.
right? And we have seen the kids had seen the entities. Now, do you think that those are literal entities, or do you think it's some kind of fabrication of the metasystem?
If you make a catalog of all the entities associated with UFOs, which I've tried to do, I thought I was
Yeah.
close to that,
Yeah.
in the 70s and 80s. Uh, and then it breaks down, and then you redo it with what you've learned, and it still breaks down. But the fact is that the entities at Trinity are essentially identical to the entities at Socorro and the entities at Valençol. Now, you can argue about Trinity, but at Valençol and Socorro, we have very large files from multiple agencies of, in one case, the American government, in another case, the French government. At Valençol, there are 5 independent investigations that have been done by the army, by the environmental people, by the customs people who thought it was forbidden transactions with across border, and with the French equivalent of the FBI and with the gendarmerie. 5, official investigations that all came to the same conclusion that this was unidentified. They could not explain what it was. It wasn't the witness, that the witness was lying. It wasn't a balloon. It wasn't all the things that the skeptics came up to try to explain it. Same thing in Socorro. In Socorro, even the FBI was involved. Um, by they had no jurisdiction, but they were there and they helped preserve the traces. And we have testimony, which is, again, unofficial testimony from the 3 FBI agents who were there, in addition to the police, in addition to the highway patrol, in addition to the state, some of the state police experts, and in addition to the scientific experts from the site, from the site next door that was experimenting with rockets and advanced prototypes. So we have all that, and this is not, this is not a UFO group sending a couple of people there, although the UFO groups did a very good job at Socorro as well. So there is no question. In all 3 cases, the beings were the same. They breathed our air. They had a large head as large as their shoulders. They were sort of, the body was sort of ant-like, but it was definitely humanoid. I mean, 2 legs and 2 arms. They had 2 eyes. They had a small mouth, almost no nose, but they were identical in all 3 cases. And again, they were breathing air. They didn't have a breathing equipment. They didn't have a suit like we do when we go to the moon. So the we can build something on that. All the comments that I've had from the book were about Trinity, about whether the kid was lying or the kid wasn't lying. Well, since then, we've gone back and we've republished the book with more witnesses and more in-depth, research, which admittedly, I should have done at the time. Okay. But, I only went there 6 times. So, uh, and I've learned a lot from what the skeptics said. And we were confident. But people have not reacted to the new things that I found at Socorro and the new things I know about Valençol. And people either have dropped the book at that point, which is probably my fault as a writer, uh, or they just didn't pay attention because they were just reacting to the first, 100 pages. So we have to take those cases as a whole. And, why doesn't Congress tell the Arrow or whatever they are called today to go back and read their own books? I mean, their own archives. Those are the archives of Socorro. Again, I have the totality of it. It's on the web. I mean, you can dump it. It's going to take a lot of time to print it out because it's very big. But you have a record of all that. And if you want a summary of it, they can get my book. I mean, it's not that hard. And those are cases that have been investigated in depth by competent people who had access to all the witnesses. The story the Air Force was saying is that who knows about Socorro? It's a single witness case. This policeman saw something and maybe he was dreaming or maybe he was drinking, which is an insult to him because there were 12 other witnesses within an hour who contacted the police in Socorro to testify about what they had seen. We know exactly the trajectory of how the object got there, and we know where it went when it left. And I found one more testimony, which is impeccable, from a high officer on the on the range itself, whose car died when he saw that object was on the trajectory when it went off to the mountains going southwest and essentially killed his car, which was an army car that he was maintaining because he was head of the motor pool. And he described that testimony has not been published before. It's in the book that I published with Paola Harris. You can get the book for $20. And doesn't Congress have $20 to go get that book? And then you would reframe the questions you're going to ask the Department of Defense about this whole thing. Other people have published books about this and about other cases that are equally good. Why don't we go back to that?
Well, since we're talking on objects here, you mentioned Congress and their kind of investigation. In your last book, Forbidden Science, Volume 5, and I saw reoccurring in Forbidden Volume 6, just very briefly, a mention of, I guess, something you were following or investigating. That something has to do with an alleged crash retrieval program, or at least a code name thereof, called Zodiac. What's your current understanding of what Zodiac is or was and its context?
Well, first Zodiac was classified at a level that I don't know, but I certainly never had access to that level or to that specific area. As you know, I did have a clearance during the time of one of a couple of the studies we did, but I don't have the clearance anymore, and anyway, it wouldn't be at that level. My Eric Davis has written about Zodiac. I think he's written on the web about what he could tell about his investigations of Zodiac. I would just defer to Eric and his knowledge of that program or those programs, I could not add anything from my own experience, related to that. I was never in close to that program or close to anyone who had been close to that program.
And you mentioned the
There may
clearances.
be several programs called Zodiac, and I wouldn't know how to tell them apart, frankly.
And what do you mean several Zodiac programs?
Well, I mean, I could start a program today and call it Zodiac, and
So, I mean, do you think that that story or investigation is legitimate?
there was, again, I really trust what Eric has found so far about Zodiac. There are uh, uh, there are several ways things can classify things. When you're inducted into a classified system, they tell you you can't talk about this as long as we don't tell you that you can talk about that, or it's in the public domain. So there are lots of that's what happens in technology. The technology can be protected by a military classification, but eventually everybody knows about the transistor, and then if I was inducted into a secret system about the transistor, and I couldn't talk about it for years. Now I can talk about the transistor. So there is a point where things leak, they become public accidentally, or they become just ordinary stuff that everybody knows. So I think in with Zodiac, there are things that are known, and then there are things that are still in under discussion. Uh, but again, I have not tried to understand more than what has been published on the web about Zodiac.
Right. Uh, the Yeah, just so for people watching and listening, that actually came out publicly in a particular document or email chain that was part of Dr. Edgar Mitchell's archives, and that inquiry about that code name or program was brought up, and that has to do with crash retrievals and in
What we know now from other sources, people who were involved in those things have started to testify, admittedly under conditions that preserve the secret, but there there is a lot of speculation about the fact that yes, there was a retrieval program, and it led to analysis of materials and all that. So at some point, it becomes a moot point what the thing was called. Uh, I think the public struggling with, and all of us struggling with some of those keywords, um, sometimes um, like the Global Explorer was protected by four different levels of secrecy, all of which involve some people, but not everybody. And then if you didn't know all four levels, you would not know that there was a vessel, a surface vessel, equipped with incredible technology, which, by the way, is still classified in part to retrieve an extraordinary Soviet submarine from an inaccessible place under the ocean. Uh, you really had to know all of that. Now, most of those levels have been, declassified, and now we know most of the story, although not all the story. And so when something is at that level, I wouldn't just rely on one keyword or one secret, password. You need to get to know the whole thing,
It's
and
so
eventually we will. But
so hypothetically, right? Or let's speculate. What if that's the case with the Zodiac thing, right? What where would that fit in? I mean, how would that fit into the four level security tier?
um, I'm not completely at ease answering your question. There is nothing wrong with your question, but um, I don't want to say things that would accidentally impinge on, what people are doing now, for example, and so on, that I'm only peripherally aware of. That's a problem of being a scientist in a large classified set of things, that you don't know what the ultimate reason is for certain things. So you can you can complain that they haven't given you all the information, even though you have a secret clearance for part of it. But somebody at this level has to be careful about you don't know everything about the program. There are enough interesting things for me to do now with what I know and the people I know. I mean, most of the investigations I've done didn't were not classified. I mean, somebody calls me because I've friends who are close to some of the UFO groups, or just people who've read my book, inviting me to look at what's in their backyard, and or strange metal that they found. And this is something I can do without any clearance of any kind. This is a civilian thing, and I've tried to make the point that the civilian data is better than all the Air Force, Navy, and everything data. It's complementary to it, and you can go there and talk to the people this afternoon, and you don't need to jump through all the loops and be aware of all the forbidden stuff, because these people are real and you can talk to them, and to some extent we have some of that stuff. The problem is, how do we bring it to a good lab, and how do we study it? And that's a challenge to us as scientists. Um, I used to talk to Dr. Hynek one time. We were looking at the telescope in the dome at Northwestern University in Chicago. I mean, not in Evanston. And he said, well, no, we've got this 40-inch telescope. There are people with 200-inch telescopes. They can do a lot better, a lot more things in science. And we have this, 40-inch telescope. That's a good thing for the students to learn about astronomy and so on. We can do a lot of things. And he said, look, yeah, better, maybe they have a 200-inch telescope, but it's looking at something very specific. It's a very expensive resource. It's looking at, 1 minute of arc of the whole sky. I can look at, I mean, and maybe nobody's using it right now. And maybe there is a supernova, and that we can see from Chicago tonight. And with this 40-inch telescope, we can get data that's essential to understand that supernova. We can get a good spectrum of that supernova in, today, I mean, tonight. And that other observatories that are better equipped, but maybe they are not looking. And I think that's a problem we have with UFOs. We're waiting for the Air Force to tell us something. The Air Force has already been in that. They're not going
Well,
to be
Jacques,
caught in this again if they can avoid it. Okay. I
we
mean,
want.
over the Nimitz, the Air Force was flying over the fleet. How come all the testimony we have are from Navy pilots? I mean, the Air Force pilots didn't see anything. Well, okay. Uh, well, we have to accept that they didn't see anything. But come on, there are better places if we want to study the phenomenon than even an aircraft carrier under steam. Uh, the people I meet in the field on their own property, they know about. I mean, that's the beauty of the Bigelow Ranch. They know the reactions of animals. They can see the traces. They can detect whether things are coming again. They they have a range of observations that are very valuable for a scientist, and that you don't need a clearance. It's not secret. You can go there, and they'll give you a cup of coffee, and they'll take you there, and you'll have a chance
Or
to do the test you want to do.
well, here's another test, right? Is CE5, right? Or if you
I'm
want to,
just bouncing the ball with you,
no,
but
of course, I
I'm
love
not
it,
trying to
Jacques.
get out of the question. That
No, I hear you.
there are there are also thresholds I shouldn't cross with
Not
respect to
and
my colleagues and so
no,
on who know more than I do.
I'm happy that you're sharing everything that you do, and you're talking about, you know, you know, researching and being in the field and speaking to some of the experiencers. But what do you make of the recent conversation around the psionics, and they're going out and they're interacting directly with the phenomenon, similar to CE5, in which you're doing protocols and you're engaging the phenomenon directly.
I applaud that. I think we need to be, you know, more and more uh, stimulated by this and stimulated to design more of those things. Again, we did that with NEDs. We did that to some extent with BAS. We wanted to do more. Uh, but some of those things can be done by a small group of people who are technically savvy and have equipment. I mean, it's not that hard now with to get the right equipment and monitor something and wait for something to happen.
Yeah, I have a number of questions that I did want to get to. Some they're kind of tangent, random questions that I had on a list. I was like, what do I want to ask Jacques Vallée? One thing was actually, um, and you assisted in helping with mapping Mars, correct?
Say that again?
Mapping Mars.
Yes.
So, during that, was there any kind of like anomaly that came up?
Oh, well, Mars is. We knew so little about it that everything was an anomaly. You have structures. You have the geologists were staring at all kinds of formations that we don't have here, and people are still puzzled by that. Well, it's a different planet. It's only, you know, it's a relatively smaller planet than the Earth. It has all kinds of different formations, all kinds of different phenomena happening with its atmosphere that we still don't completely understand, and so on. So, my problem was there were maps of Mars before. I mean, there were generations of astronomers, including my boss. Gerard de Vaucouleurs was a planetary specialist, and he had produced maps of Mars during earlier oppositions when he was still in France, and then when he was in Australia and so on. So he was not naive about Mars. And we had catalogs of from all the previous oppositions of Mars where something had been measured. The problem was that NASA was going to send two probes that were going to fly by and send images of Mars. The problem that NASA had was that those images, they would not know where to put them on the map of the planet because they were at a resolution that was much higher than what astronomers had seen from the Earth. So there was a gap there in, you have a beautiful image of a place and you don't know where it is. So they needed a map that was 10 times better than the map that had been produced by astronomers from Earth. So what I had to do was improve the map by a factor of 10. And then they could use that and they could match it to the images they were hoping to get from Mariner. And so it was, it's a three-dimensional problem in spherical coordinates that every good astronomer should know how to solve. And I was asked to write the program, and the program worked, and we had to reduce. There were errors by when you make a measure in science, there is always an error. It's never perfect. Okay, so if you, with a different telescope, look at Mars on a different night and you measure something, you're not going to find the same measurement that I found. And I think you're a good astronomer, and I think I'm a good astronomer. But there is an error between your measurement and my measurement. Now, we had, for some of those points, we had 20 measurements over different oppositions of the planet. So the question was in part a statistical question, and in part of you know, an amelioration of the calculations in multiple steps, recurrent steps about the same points, until we could get to a better statistical agreement in the computer. So that's what we did for something like 100 points on Mars, and then we turned it over to NASA, and NASA used that map once. I don't think they ever needed to use it again, because after that they had the photographs that they could, not the photographs, but the images, the numerical images that they could match to the map that my computer had produced at the University of Texas. And then from that, they could get the map we're using now.
But you don't think anything ever found on Mars has been artificial?
Uh, there is a continuing question about the satellites, whether, uh, well, the idea of artificial that came from Shklovsky in Moscow. When I was in Moscow, I would have hoped to meet with Shklovsky. I met with some of the people on his team, and we discussed whether they still felt it was a possible hypothesis. Sagan agreed with that. The question is, we don't know. We didn't know the exact mass of the satellites to conform it to their orbit. I think a lot of that has been resolved, but there are still questions about where those satellites came from, whether they were captured by Mars or whether they were pieces of rock and matter that coalesced at the same time when the planet was formed. It's more likely that they were captured, like we think the Earth may have captured some things that may still be in orbit around the Earth, that are small things that we may or may not have detected well enough to understand where they came from. So now that we have the means to look at all that, I think we'll be able to resolve it. And certainly, hopefully Elon Musk is going to resolve it at some point where he can put attention on science again and leave politics behind.
Yeah. Well, and
That's a
just
joke. I mean,
yeah, it's something else. Right. Uh, but there was another question that I did want to get to in regards to maybe something that's uh, augmented your thinking at all, or just I guess I would say your research into Rosicrucianism. What do you think that number one, what was how in depth was your study into Rosicrucianism, and number two, what benefit did you see or do you see from it?
oh, Rosicrucianism.
Yes, 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 yes.
Okay. No, sorry. Um, um, that's a long story. Why don't we keep it for another?
Sure, for sure,
Quite open to do another session any time you want.
sure. Uh, there, yeah. I mean,
To I know we're both interested in philosophy and so on, and I try to, in the answers I've given you so far, I've always tried to relate it, and maybe I was long-winded in doing that, but to relate it with actual cases, with actual people, because on the web today there's a lot of speculation about philosophy, which is delightful. I mean, it's great that we're getting at that phenomenon in in a classical way. Uh, but in when talking about witnesses, I try to stay close to what people have actually told me that happened in their presence, because I can imagine lots of things. I've read lots of books, and I could speculate on where it goes. But from a scientific tradition, where you start from experiments and observed reality. Now, observed reality has mistakes attached to it and all that, but at least there is somebody you can go back to, and then you hope to get additional testimony that bear on the same phenomenon. And that's the way I learned science. And um, I think there is too much in science today that is pure speculation, where we have no hope of designing an experiment to prove the assertions, to prove the statements we make. And that's, um, including some really basic science. The Like the black force and things of that type. Well, it's hypothetical constructs to try to account for things that don't match what we see. But unless you can design an experiment based on that, that's going to prove something, it's probably a waste of time. So, and if you want to go back to the Rosicrucians at the beginning were experimental physicists.
yes,
They were people designing experiments, the experiments that they took into the realm of consciousness, not just matter. And they had a way of doing that, which was very rational. And but bridging to the mystical. And I think that's why it's interesting. But they started from experiments. I've gone to Prague. Uh, in Prague, you can still look at some of the laboratories and the original laboratories of the uh, the people who were doing transmutation and so on, but they were doing all kinds of things other than transmutation. And you can look at their, I mean, it would put some modern laboratories to shame in terms of the equipment that they were designing to do some of the transmutations and some of the chemical experiments we can redo with their equipment. We can redo them successfully today.
Yeah, and I just have a few more brief questions. Speaking of your books, Diana Pasulka had mentioned that you had recommended to her a book. I believe it's on the history of Satan or something along those lines. Number
There is of course, there are people saying we should not look, including, I think, some of the military brass, saying we shouldn't look at UFOs because it could be from the dark, side. And in there is a book about to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert on that, but to my knowledge, the best book on Satanism is a book simply called Satan, written by a group of nuns in France. And it's a collection of essays by scholars and by people from the Catholic Church, primarily, about the history of Satanism, a review of the history of the witches, um, tribunals that condemned witches to death over the centuries, and a review of what they thought they learned out of the questions that they put to the witches and the torture and all of that. This group of nuns is one of the more academic groups. These are women who have been trained in history, in science, in literature, and in different languages and so on. And they've produced a whole series of books of extraordinary books on frontier subjects. So the book is published by that order of nuns, uh, and it has 666 pages,
yeah,
which were, I mean, these women were essentially were not afraid of challenging their subject, openly in publishing a book that had 666 pages. So they had a sense of humor, and you need a sense of humor if you're going. The problem with many people who get into that is that they have no sense of humor, and that's only one part of the equipment you should have.
yeah, and
It's an extraordinary book. They also had the audacity and the courage to research the biological experiments of the Nazi during World War II. But the book about Satan was published during World War II in France. Uh, After the war, when all the stories came out about the camps, they researched with medical people. They researched the experiments that the Nazi doctors were doing, and their book is, it's actually more fascinating than the book about Satan, which, I mean, there are lots of books about Satan that you can get. There are not that many books that go in depth about what the Nazi doctors were trying to do, and some of which is relevant to modern medicine, because we would not do those experiments today, certainly not with human beings, because you would never see your lab again if you did those experiments, although people are going to be tempted to do it with, with DNA, and they could be done. the the Nazi had no knowledge about DNA, but they were looking at the extreme conditions for the human body, some of which is, I'm sorry to say, useful to know in medicine today, because we cannot redo those experiments morally and ethically, but since they were done, and they were done by competent doctors, they wanted to see, the nuns wanted to document how far they went. And it's a very difficult book to read. Uh, you can have fun with Satan and all the things about Satan, but you cannot have fun about some of those other books that they did. And I'm both grateful and impressed by what those sisters have done. They are still working.
Yeah, and just two more questions, Jacques. You met an individual in which Diana Pasulka had written about his, the pseudonym Tyler D.
And his name,
Tyler D. I mean, his real name Tim, the NASA Space Control,
uh, I don't remember that.
Timothy Taylor.
Tim Teller, of course, has been written up in a couple of books, and I have met him. Yeah.
What
Um,
what was your conversation interaction with him like? Without disclosing details, like
um, well, first, I admire him as an inventor. He wrote an earlier book which was strictly about being an engineer and helping companies develop and getting those companies funded and so on. He was very involved at an executive level in a company that had to do with implants out of bone, out of human bone. Well, I've been on the board of a company that did exactly the same thing, and we took that company public. So, as an investor, as a venture capitalist, I went through the same things that he went through with the company he was involved in, which was also successful. And so I have a lot of respect for what he did because I know how hard those things are. Um, so that's my calibration, when he talks about space and what's out there and the things that he researched and the analysis of materials from sites and so on, which was the most, the best, the most topic of our conversation. Having said that, I've only had one conversation face to face with him. Um, all the others were sort of group conversations that were sort of general conversations. So he's not someone I know really well. Uh, I certainly admire his book
yeah.
and the companies he's worked with.
Yeah, because allegedly he has an affiliation with a lot of these agencies from NRO. Apparently has a number of badges, right? CIA. Yeah, was
I
your
don't. I don't have. I've heard that. I don't have access to those topics in a structured way. And if I did, I couldn't talk about it anyway. So, I mean, those are, obviously there are lots of good science that's applied to space these days. And, and it,
yeah. Uh, just one more question then. If you had to make an update or revision to the 6-layer model, would you, or would you keep it as is?
Um, I don't know what Eric would say to that. Um, the model is an operational model. I mean, if 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 you're going to do an analysis, remember, I mean, one classified project I was in charge of, which is still classified, is a computer project for BAS, okay, which involved roughly 30 people and occasionally more people. Uh, and we created, as you know, that has been authorized for disclosure. We uh, we created a catalog of 260,000 cases that is really a data warehouse. You cannot create one catalog of UFO cases because the pilots see things that are different from people on the ground and people with instruments, people without instruments, and so on. So and also some of those catalogs I supplied, and they were in French or in Spanish, which I can read. Uh, but there are also catalogs in Russian, catalogs in Chinese, and so on, that were outside of my knowledge, that were acquired separately. So those things of the project had to do with reducing all that in a structure that was not a given by us, but came out of the structure of the experience itself. And that's what the classification is about. It's not, uh, as opposed to the earlier classifications that were mostly from the point of view of a casual observer and so on. So the classification is built the the data warehouse. Okay, and it is a classification from which you can build. I mean, if you have a better classification for what you want to do, you can build it on top of ours. Okay, so that's what we were doing, was building a basic level that everybody could agree on in English, with uh, with only the number of codes that you need to describe, the physical conditions, the physiological conditions, and everything else. So those were universally adopted codes, and you can build your own project on top of it. I mean, that was the idea. We were cut off at the knee after only 2 years, so we never got into the higher level structures that I had designed that are lost forever. So somebody will have to start from scratch. The in all that, one thing that's not classified is the fact that we uh, let go of the whole team. And it was a team that we had trained for 2 years in understanding the data. In my work as a computer scientist, I've been exposed several times to situations where you would think that you could hire somebody, a postdoc, in biology, or a postdoc in physics with a couple of PhDs to work on a project. And that's not true. You can hire them, but then you have to get them immersed in the special situations of the project to understand. At Stanford, one of the things I did when I was at the computation center as a computer scientist was I built the first computer catalog of heart transplants in the world. Well, there was no structure that I was given to build that file, which was a computer file, and to enable the doctors who were doing pioneering plant transplants to work with the existing file and to build on it and to design new measurements and new instruments based on what they already knew that was in the file. So I had to build a structure going around the medical school at Stanford saying, how would you call this? And what's this instrument? And what are the units that you work with? And so on. They had all that in written, in pen and pencil files. And I had
Yeah.
to take those files. Those files were very large because they had done the first 11 heart transplantations, not quite the first ones, but they had done more than anybody else, than any other hospital. And you'd think that just having a file with 11 records would be a simple thing, and it isn't, because the patients were getting every test known to medicine every morning after breakfast. So we had an enormous amount of data that was changing in ways that had to be studied because there had never been patients in those conditions in a hospital before. And they had a group of them, not just one or two. And so that system had to anticipate everything that would be known to medicine later. So it had to be open so that they could take control of the program and change it rationally or without rewriting everything that had been done. Well, to some extent, we have to do the same kind of thing. So I was trying to apply that to the team, and a number of us gave lectures at the beginning to get the team into the culture of what we're doing. We had 4 translators who could take, French into English, Spanish, Russian into English, and so on. And that's the way we built the team. That team is gone. So whoever in Washington decided to stop the funding and disband the team has committed a crime. I mean, we can't put him to jail, uh, him or her, but whoever cut the budget of that particular program has dissipated the knowledge, the training that we gave, a group of people that we would dearly love to have now, because you cannot put out an ad and find those people in the environment, in the labor force of America today. They don't exist anymore. Okay? But those are the things that people don't think of, when they make a law or when they decide on uh, taking a budget from one place and moving it to another and so on. That has an impact on the research. So in the catalogs that we build are somewhere, whether they've leaked or have legally moved somewhere, but the intelligence that we had built into the structure and into what we were going to do with it has vaporized. So I have a lot of respect for my peers in computer science. I think they will do a very good job, but they will have to reconstruct a lot of things from scratch, and that's a crime.
Yeah. And just one more question, Jacques. If you had to design an experiment to interact with the phenomenon or the meta system, how would that experiment look?
I, um, I'm not comfortable answering that.
Okay.
Number one, I don't want to influence people, and people have to do whatever they want to do, that their imagination suggests. I mean, that's the way science works. I shouldn't tell my colleagues what to design, uh, because we start from a different we start from a different body of data. Um, the data in Brazil is very different from the data in Massachusetts or the data in France. And there are people, really good people, coming in now with good ideas, and with the good Lord willing, I'll be able to maybe design my own experiments, but I'll certainly try to make the data, more data available to people as time goes on, if I can.
For sure. And I just want to, you know, give you a of gratitude for doing all the work that you do, that you continue to do, for writing the books that you have, documenting, sharing your very personal journals. Um, and I mean, there's so many great tidbits of insight and information in there that they're of great historical value. So, thank you for everything that you've done and continue to do. I'm going to link the book in the description so people can take a look at it and pick it up. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again sometime soon, Jacques.
Thank you. I
Thank you
look
so
forward
much.
to doing this again and
Yes,
when the
sir.
time is right.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.